Welcome, everyone. This special presentation was conceived of earlier this year with our conference task force when we talked about something that we mentioned this morning. And what we talked about this morning is all of the collateral issues that AML professionals deal with in 2016, and nothing is more challenging and more of a horrific crime than human trafficking. And I think, as we've also mentioned, the financial sector has done quite a bit in this space in the past several years. In fact, we gave an award, a joint award, to the Department of Homeland Security and JP Morgan Chase for their leadership in dealing with human trafficking and developing typologies and trying to give bankers ways, financial institutions ways to figure out how to follow the money. But we also think it's so important of an issue, and obviously is still a major global problem, that we want to continue to provide information and data and examples for all of you so that you can better equip your staffs to look out for activities of this horrific crime. I'm pleased to have with me this afternoon Sara Crowe. Sara is with Polaris. Polaris, I think many of you should know, is a leader in the global fight to eradicate modern slavery. Sara is focused on providing key stakeholders with valuable data to inform strategies that are aimed at addressing and preventing human trafficking. In her current role, she's responsible for the quality and utility of one of the largest human trafficking specific data sets in the world, and we'll talk a bit about that today. So first of all, Sara, welcome, and thanks for all that you and your organization do.
Well, thank you so much for having me, John. I'm really excited to be here.
So what I want to start with, and I don't think it's ever too basic, is definitions. Right? Because I think a lot of times folks in our part of compliance look at human trafficking and don't divide the different aspects of it. And I think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, understanding the definitions might better help you prepare to deal with it from a financial perspective. But give us your definitions and examples, if you could.
Absolutely. So human trafficking is slavery. It's when somebody is forced to work against their will or forced to engage in commercial sex against their will. By federal and international law, it would also include people who are under the age of 18 that are involved in engaging in commercial sex, whether they say that they were forced to or not, because those people are considered unable to give consent at that time. I think one of the biggest pieces of confusion when it comes to the definition is the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. They are two distinct crimes. So whereas human trafficking is a crime against a person, human smuggling is a crime against a state. It means bringing someone across borders illegally. Human trafficking, it's a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't actually require any movement. A lot of the cases we've seen have been entirely located. The person has been recruited and exploited all in one area.
That's an interesting point. I think there was some view that this was a non-US issue, and then we saw a number of volunteers in the banking industry say just what you did, that a lot of this occurs in our own backyard in the US. So it is people that are recruited from one state to another. We have people in Jefferson City, Missouri. One of our advisory board members has done a lot of work in that space because it's happening in truck stops and other places. But isn't that one of the biggest misconceptions?
Yes, definitely. So there's a lot of focus on human trafficking overseas. I'm going to go ahead and show the map. These are human trafficking cases that were reported to our hotline last year. So Polaris runs the national hotline for victims of human trafficking. Already this year, we've received, in the first 6 months of 2016, tips about 4,000 human trafficking cases occurring within the US. And in half of these, the victims are US citizens who maybe have never even left the country.
So the other part of it is this is an AML conference. So trying to figure out human trafficking in a money laundering context. Obviously, there's been cases, but give us some sense of that. So money laundering, as we all know, is the movement of proceeds of some illegal activity to further another illegal activity. But money laundering is clearly a part of this, right?
Right, and one of the reasons I was so excited to be here is because financial institutions are in a really unique place to identify and combat this crime. Human trafficking is purely motivated by greed. People want to make money. And so if you're able to go after the profits of traffickers, that's going to be a really significant way to impact the problem. Human trafficking itself, at the end of the day, when people are laundering money after making that money through human trafficking, a lot of the techniques they're using are very similar to techniques that narcotics traffickers or arms smugglers would also use. The difference, though, is kind of the starting point of what red flags to look out for that might spark your interest and want to investigate a situation a little bit differently. One thing about human trafficking is that it is incredibly diverse. So labor trafficking and sex trafficking look completely different, and the red flags you'll see in each will look different. So educating yourself about the different types is really important. Polaris has created a typology of about 25 types of trafficking that we see commonly within the US. And then we have information about how those types operate, and from that you can start to see indicators and things that you could flag as a financial professional. So I have a couple of examples. I think when people talk about human trafficking, a lot of what comes to mind is sex trafficking, but I really wanted to take a moment to highlight labor trafficking. It's estimated that there are at least as many labor trafficking victims in the world as there are sex trafficking victims. And domestic servitude is one that maybe wouldn't come to mind when you think about human trafficking, but often these are people who the traffickers are very wealthy and powerful people. A lot of the victims of this type of trafficking have actually been employed by diplomats. And essentially they're brought to the US to work as domestic help. They're not allowed to leave their house, or if they are, it's fairly rare. They're heavily monitored. They're asked to work approximately, on call 24 hours a day and really aren't compensated. It's a tough industry because it's almost completely unregulated by labor laws, but it is something to be aware of. So one thing I wanted to highlight that diplomats who are here on certain types of visas and bring in domestic help are required to open bank accounts for those workers. However, once they're open, nobody is really monitoring if those workers are being paid or not. So things to look out for would be people who are coming to the bank, usually chaperoned by their employer, a bank account that lists both the employer and the employee on the bank account, bank accounts that are open but deposits are never made, or deposits are made but then the money is being transferred directly back to the employer. All of these are kind of things to look out for because there's a lot of bank fraud that goes along with this.
Why would they open up an account with no deposits made? I certainly understand deposits that quickly get moved, but you actually have seen examples where they just open the account and there's no activity?
Yes, and so that is, the Department of State is aware of several very high-profile trafficking cases that have involved diplomats. As part of their work to try and curtail this problem, they require diplomats bringing in domestic workers to show evidence that they opened a bank account for their workers. But nobody is really checking to see if that money is actually ever deposited in that account.
Wow, that's interesting. And also the one there, final checks closing out an account, and that final check is written to the employer.
Right, exactly.
And when you see it, you say, well, that's an obvious red flag, right?
But I think it takes a little bit of knowing who to look at. Diplomats are maybe not the people that come to mind when it comes to human trafficking, but there have been several very large cases involving diplomats. I have a couple of other types of trafficking I wanted to talk about. The second most common form of labor trafficking we see in agriculture, but a lot of these indicators would apply to other forms of labor trafficking as well. One thing to be aware of in these industries is that typically the workers are being recruited by foreign labor recruiters. So the labor supply chain is extremely complicated. And often what will happen is those labor recruiters will say to somebody in Mexico or the Philippines, I'll get you a job in the US, I'll bring you into the US, you'll have a visa, but then you owe me, an absurd debt that these people can never pay off. So any indication that someone might be in debt, for instance, employees of the same company all wiring money back to the same company in Mexico or the Philippines, is an indication of debt. It's illegal to charge people money for getting them a visa, but it does happen frequently. You'll see workers, especially on farms, who have very little access to the outside world. They'll maybe be brought to a retail establishment like once a week, so something like a Walmart or some other retail establishment, and then you'll see that everyone will cash their checks at the same time. Indications that every employee is receiving exactly the same amount of money. Fines paid to Department of Labor or OSHA are significant, that this is a company to look at a little bit further. Those are types of things we see in labor trafficking.
It's interesting, too, the age-old structuring of financial transactions,
right,
which you see in so many different crimes,
yes,
is obviously part of this. And the other one that struck me, which is obviously an easy one, checks from one employer all endorsed on the same day at a retail establishment. Right. And that certainly could be a variety of things. And then funds transfer from workers to one bank in the country of origin, to your point. So right, they're all recruited or they're all forced from that country, right, and then the checks go back there, the funds go back there.
Exactly. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some sex trafficking venues. Again, as I said before, we've documented about 25 major types of trafficking in the US, but I wanted to hit on some of the ones that are the most common. Illicit massage businesses are businesses that are fronting as legitimate massage businesses, but are providing commercial sex. And this is an industry that people are often very aware of. If you go online, you can find sites that list every illicit massage business in a city. So sites like Backpage.com, that's the biggest advertiser of commercial sex in the US, Rubmaps.com. If you log onto those sites, you get a list of all the businesses where commercial sex is happening. Of course, just because commercial sex is happening doesn't mean human trafficking is necessarily happening, but in a lot of these situations, we're seeing money that's being transferred to kind of funnel accounts in places like San Francisco and then being transferred out of the country to China, to South Korea. And then within China, we've noticed most of the funds going to the provinces that border North Korea. So that's a little bit of something to look out for. You can also notice these businesses because there are going to be transactions that are occurring at very odd hours for a legitimate massage business. All of the transactions are on credit cards registered to men. Typically, if a woman tried to go and get a massage at this business, they're going to be turned away. They're not even allowed in the door. And then another interesting factor is that a lot of illicit massage businesses have ATMs on site. There's often like a $60 house fee, and then tip is extra for additional services. So all things to be aware of.
Question for you. I've read some articles about human trafficking, and while there shouldn't be opponents to doing things to prevent it, you will hear some people say, well, in some cases that trafficking is prostitution.
Right.
So how do you deal, as an organization, how do you deal with that view to make people aware that that does happen, but obviously what you're focused on is the sex trafficking that occurs for people against their will?
Exactly. It's a very complicated issue. A lot of people in commercial sex are coming from very vulnerable communities, so sometimes it can be hard to figure out just how much willingness was involved. We try to draw a distinction, though, that we're really only focused on people who are being made to do this against their will, or minors. People who are engaged in commercial sex for other reasons or because they want to be there, I'm not going to make any judgment statements about that. I think that's up to everyone to decide on their own, but I think we can all collectively agree that no one should be made to do this against their will.
You were going to talk about these cantinas?
Yes. So cantinas is an extremely interesting type of trafficking. We recently put out a report, and the first 2 people that come and introduce themselves to me after this can get a copy of it, although you can also get it on our website. Cantinas are what we refer to as a type of trafficking where they're restaurants or bars where patrons go to pay for very, very overpriced drinks, and then commercial sex will also occur. And we call them cantinas because these are very closely tied to Latino communities. So the city that's been kind of the most successful in prosecuting these cases is Houston. So a lot of what we know about cantinas comes out of Houston. But these are often people who are smuggled into the United States from Mexico or Central America, and then are being held against their will at these businesses. They often have a quota of money that they have to make in a day. There's a lot of physical abuse, a lot of sexual abuse, and it's one of those that, other than Houston, there haven't been a lot of cases. So one thing that's tricky about cantinas is that it's almost entirely a cash-based business. Even Houston law enforcement, who investigated some of the big cantina cases in Houston, couldn't account for all the profits that were being made because these people were making so much money and they couldn't find where all the money was going. But they did notice that a lot of the money was being moved out of the US, again, through kind of these funnel accounts. And money transfers to known trafficking hubs, especially Tenancingo, Mexico, which is a town that is well known for having a lot of human trafficking networks running out of it. They've also, in these cases, there have been people at the banking institutions that have flagged the interactions with patrons as suspicious because a lot of the victims are actually made to go into the financial institution and wire the money themselves. So bank tellers were noticing things like people not really having identification, using different names, always transferring the exact same amount of money, which is usually a round number, to the same place. And then at times they were even seeing people who had bruises, like they had clearly been physically abused, and were flagging those as suspicious.
This conference, besides an AML conference, we deal with a lot of terrorist related activity. We're going to do a big session tomorrow on that, and there's sadly a major connection between human trafficking and terrorism, right?
Right. I was at a session on cartels earlier, and it was mentioned that cartels are not they're not solely dedicated to narcotics trafficking. They'll go where the money is, and so in that session they talked a little bit about how cartels are tied to these terrorist organizations, but it's the same thing with human trafficking organizations. So there are 3 main ways terrorist organizations might be involved in human trafficking. One, they're forcing or coercing people to participate in terrorism. So by international law, child soldiers are victims of human trafficking. Any group that uses a child soldier is guilty of it. There are sex trafficking networks. So these have been pretty well publicized recently, but ISIS and Boko Haram, they were abducting women or recruiting women and then using them kind of as sex slaves for their fighters. So that has been kind of a horrific thing that has come out of the unrest in the Middle East recently. And then finally, a lot of these organizations may be financed by revenue from human trafficking. So just like funding from narcotics trafficking can end up in terrorist hands, the same thing is true of human trafficking. I listed some of the organizations that we've heard about that are considered terrorist organizations that have suspected ties to human trafficking. I'm sure there's a lot more out there. Right. And finally, I think in addition to terrorist organizations, it's important to note other organized crime groups that are involved in human trafficking. So Not all human trafficking involves an organized crime group. As I talked about before, it's often one individual, but a lot of groups are involved. So the cartel we've heard about the most is Los Zetas. I'm sure there are other cartels that have been involved. There have been some very high-profile cases in the DC area with MS-13, who kind of switched over from narcotics trafficking to sex trafficking for a period of time. And then we'll even hear about motorcycle groups like Hell's Angels, who are trafficking women among the gang members.
So your final points on your last slide here is the dealing with financial activity. But before we talk about that, a couple things I wanted to ask you about. The red flags, you mentioned a few of them. Department of Homeland Security and their Operation Blue campaign,
right,
and the work that they've done. They've issued a lot as well, and certainly the FBI has. In addition to Polaris, where can folks go for other information on not just red flags, but both information about the scope of the problem, but maybe some cases that have been brought? Again, law enforcement will do some of that, but from your perspective, say somebody's a compliance officer, gets into a small bank, wants to get the institution involved in this issue, where would they go for source material? Now, we'd give them some from our website, but what would you tell them?
Well, PolarisProject.org is definitely a great resource. Also, our national hotline has its own website, traffickingresourcecenter.org. There's a lot of material on there. Another one, if you want to look at case studies, would be the University of Michigan Law School Clinic. They have a database of trafficking cases that have been prosecuted throughout the United States. So if you kind of want to do a bit of a forensic analysis, starting at cases that were identified and working backwards, you might be able to identify more trends that way.
We do have time. If anybody has questions, there's microphones, I believe, in both the aisles here. But what I wanted to mention, tomorrow we're going to be giving an award to a gentleman from the Fairfax County Police Department for career work. What he's told me before is that, and he's, again, in Fairfax County where I live, he said virtually every nail salon in Fairfax County is either a front for sex trafficking or forced labor trafficking. That's an area, it's not a massage parlor, but that's,
right.
Can you talk about some of the other retail establishments that could be, based on what we've seen in the past, could be a front for that? Or what would you look for also in terms of forced labor in those situations?
Yeah, so that's definitely a tricky situation. The New York Times did a very interesting investigative journalism piece into nail salons in the New York area, where the level of exploitation was really, really extreme. Again, all of these industries that are bringing in foreign workers, where there is the potential for debt. Other things to look out for would be, in a lot of the nail salon cases, the people are actually made to live on premises. So if there's a retail establishment that's buying all of these different kind of household products, often they will make the women live on the premises, and then they'll be made to buy any sort of basic necessity, deodorant, toothpaste, at a very, very marked up rate from their employer. So if you're wondering why a nail salon is buying so much toothpaste or something like that, that could be another red flag.
Interesting. We have a question over here.
Hi, John and Sarah. So I had done some extensive research on human trafficking a couple of years ago, and I know that you're referencing most of the human trafficking that's occurring in the U.S. My question involves U.S. companies that are getting component parts or raw materials from international organizations or companies that are using slave labor, child labor. There was a list that was published a couple of years ago of some of the bigger companies. They were calling for boycotts. I haven't seen anything recently about those companies, and I'm wondering what the government is doing about that situation. And then secondly, if we bank those companies, what should we be doing? Is that SAR-fileable?
So that's a great question. supply chains are a huge issue and an area where a lot of different corporations are really looking into their own supply chains. The Obama administration did sign an executive order that covers government contractors, which has extra regulations which require them to prove certain supply chain transparency to ensure that there was no forced labor involved in the supply chain. California has a pretty some good legislation about supply chain transparency as well. There are a number of different kind of watchdog organizations out there who flag corporations that have used exploitative labor practices in their supply chains. But there's so much more that can be done, and I know, like in the fishing industry, so much of the fish that we eat, you can't really trace it back. The way the industry is structured is it's these big boats, and then smaller boats will come and get the fish and bring them to the market, or not the market, but I don't know, wherever they bring the fish. And so you can't really track what boats gave the smaller boats the fish. The point is, it's extremely complicated. A lot more needs to be done on the issue, definitely. And in terms of your questions and in terms of what you should do when you know that your organization is involved, has a client that is one of these corporations which has been flagged, I mean, I think that's kind of a question to ask internally. I'm not in the anti-money laundering community. So I don't know what kind of protocols would be in place or what would typically happen, but it's definitely something I think for the community to kind of come up with some best practices there.
It's up to you, John.
Right, thanks.
Thanks.
I do think filing a suspicious activity report probably would make sense, and I know the agencies have issued guidance in this area on a number of occasions. Any last thoughts, Sarah? I mean, people should look for the Polaris project. If they want to get involved, are there local chapters of your organization? What's the best way? There's two things. Obviously, institutions can get involved by donating and being involved that way, but how can individuals get involved?
So on traffickingresourcecenter.org, there is a pretty extensive database of different organizations throughout the country that are helping victims of human trafficking in different ways. So I encourage everyone to look who is active in their community and get in touch with them directly to see what kind of assistance they need.
Great. Well, Sarah, I really appreciate you taking the time today and the amazing work that you and your group do. And I know you'll get additional volunteers out of this presentation. So
I do really want to highlight how happy I am to be here. I think there's two really major factors. One I noted before, but everyone in this room is in such a unique position to identify this crime and really make a huge impact because you are focused on the money, and that's ultimately what's motivating traffickers. The other thing I want to point out is that human trafficking is a really complex crime, and it involves people. When you're bringing a case that involves a victim, you're very dependent on victim testimony and victim cooperation. And in human trafficking cases, there's a lot of reasons people don't want to cooperate. There could be emotional abuse, there could be, real fear that they or their family could be hurt if they cooperate. So financial institutions and going after the financial crimes, while it might not be a human trafficking charge, it is definitely a way to bring some sort of justice to a lot of people who might not be in a place where they can help get justice themselves.
thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Sarah.